At that very time, there were some present who told Jesus about the Galileans whose blood Pilate had mingled with their sacrifices. He asked them, "Do you think that because these Galileans suffered in this way, that they were worse sinners than all the other Galileans?" I suppose if that question was to be posed to Jesus today, it would sound something like this. Do you think that the Ukrainian civilians who've been murdered by indiscriminate shelling in residential areas by Russian troops were worse sinners than those who managed to survive? Put in these terms, it sounds both morally obscene and theologically objectionable. After all, what would you need to have done to deserve such unprovoked, indiscriminate, and unconscionable brutality being meted out of the residents of, for example, Mariupol in recent days? And what kind of a God would perpetrate such atrocities or accommodate them within the divine plan? Yet what is almost as disturbing is the recognition that some people do think that what is taking place in Ukraine at the moment is deserved and divinely sanctioned, including presumably Vladimir Putin, who apparently is a man of religious faith, at least according to the Russian Orthodox Church's take on Christianity. There is surely only one thing more dangerous than an unconstrained autocrat harbouring expansionist ambitions with access to vast arsenals of conventional weaponry, plus over 4,500 deployable nuclear warheads, and that is an unconstrained autocrat who believes he's doing God's work. We are, my friends, in worrying times, which are made all the more difficult because we feel overwhelmed by it all and struggle to know how best to respond, whether as a sovereign nation and member of NATO, or as individuals and members of a church community such as this. And who hasn't felt at least awkward, if not guilty and ashamed, when leaders of NATO countries, including our own Prime Minister, have repeatedly closed their ears to the impassioned pleas of President Zelensky for the implementation of a no-fly zone over Ukraine in order to reduce civilian casualties? Why won't we come to the aid of our European sisters and brothers in their hour of need? In truth, doesn't Russia's flouting of the Budapest Memorandum of 1994, in which it, along with the US and the UK, committed to never threatening or using military force or economic coercion against Ukraine, demand that we do? After all, if the tables were turned, would we not hope that Ukraine would come to our aid in this way? The emotional case seems compelling. Surely, in the name of compassion, we have no choice but to accede to President Zelensky's request. Yet the resolution of this issue must take other factors into consideration as well. And this is where so-called just war theory comes into play, a moral calculus with a long pedigree reaching back to the renowned theologian of the ancient church, Augustine of Hippo, and even further. According to just war theory, as you probably know, in order for a nation to be able to justify entering into armed conflict against another nation or aggressor, there must be a just cause for doing so. It must be waged by a proper authority, motivated by a right intention, and with a reasonable chance of success, having assessed that the total good of intervening will outweigh the total evil of failing to do so. What is more, for a war to be just, it must be waged as a last resort in pursuit of peace, conducted with discrimination, avoiding intentional harm to non-combatants, whilst employing a proportionality of means, no more force than necessary. Now, by many of these criteria, NATO's involvement in hostilities to the extent of implementing a no-fly zone over Ukraine would seem just. After all, there is a just cause to assist an ally in its legitimate right to self-defense against an unlawful aggressor. It would be executed by legitimate authorities, the democratically elected governments of NATO countries, and with a right intention to reduce loss of life and to hasten cessation of hostilities. There is also, given NATO's military capabilities, a reasonable chance that such a no-fly zone could be enforced. However, and this is what currently is proving determinative, for NATO to intervene in this way would almost certainly escalate hostilities, giving Russia grounds to attack NATO countries and perhaps lead to a third world war or to a nuclear holocaust engulfing much of the planet, which would inevitably lead to much higher death count that would result from NATO maintaining constraint as it does at the moment. So for this reason, on the grounds of proportionality, whilst it would be compassionate to intervene in this way, it would not be just, according to just war theory, because however well intentioned, it would maximize suffering and loss of life rather than reduce them. Now, of course, the gamble that NATO leaders is taking is that Vladimir Putin won't interpret supplying Ukraine with so-called lethal aid, the military means to self-defense, as a military intervention, and as such, an escalation of hostilities. Who would be a head of state at this time as the world faces one, if not the most dangerous situation since the Second Great War? Now, all this may seem well above our pay grade, but that's not to say that we have no part to play in what's unfolding in the tragedy in Ukraine. If we recall this morning's Gospel reading, Jesus makes it quite clear that calamity need not be self-inflicted and can befall anyone deserving or undeserving. So when our Ukrainian brothers and sisters cry out, "What have we done to deserve this?" the answer is almost certainly nothing beyond living where you do and wishing to be governed by a democracy. And what I'm equally confident of is that what Ukrainian refugees require at this time is not judgment, but solidarity and compassion. And this is where we can play our part, whether through financial donations via the Disaster Emergency Committee, or the Red Cross, or another charitable organisation active in this crisis, or through giving in kind. And there is a list of what is urgently needed on this week's Team News. And of course, as you can see, we can drop off our gifts here. Or perhaps we can help by offering hospitality through the government's Homes for Ukraine sponsorship programme, where we provide accommodation and support for refugees in our own community. And yes, of course, we must pray. But prayer without action in this instance is like a vehicle without fuel, full of promise, but without any means of fulfillment. Remember, if without God our hands are empty, then without us, God's hands are tied. There is something we can all do, and I encourage you to respond as generously as you can, out of compassion and solidarity, mindful that none of us knows what's round the corner and what assistance we might need in the future. Let me finish with those haunting words of Pastor Niemöller, uttered in response to the failure of the German church, as well as many leading intellectuals, to speak out against the persecution of targeted groups by the Third Reich of Adolf Hitler. First they came for the communists, and I did not speak out because I was not a communist. Then they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I wasn't a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I wasn't a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak out for me.